It seems often our number one goal is to just make things as smooth and easy for our kids as possible. We really want to make their path, especially their path to learning and education, as smooth as possible. But what if I told you that in doing that, you are actually robbing them of very valuable lessons? What if the very struggles they face today will actually serve as the foundation for their strength, their resilience, their academic prowess for tomorrow? And if you're a parent homeschooling your child and you see your child struggling, it's very easy to think that you've done something wrong. You've failed them, you've let them down. Those thoughts and those fears of failure can honestly keep us up at night sometimes. They can make us think that we are not good enough. We've perhaps even made the wrong choice in choosing to homeschool our children. And believe me, I know firsthand that homeschooling and educating at home is no cakewalk, okay? It's not a picnic. I hope that in this video, I can challenge some of the ideas that you have about learning. And because I bring the receipts, we are going to talk about how the research proves that facing these challenges head on can foster a deeper understanding, greater resilience, and much more meaningful learning experiences. First thing that I want to discuss with you is something called productive struggle. And I know it sounds a little ironic, but it's actually the very foundation that your child needs to build, and then they can build upward from there. So before we get into productive struggle, I'd like to tell you a little story. Welcome to Angie's Story Hour. Are you ready? Yes, you're here. You're ready. There are two men, Ben and Tom. Ben and Tom are tasked with digging a well for their respective farms. They each have a large plot of land to dig into, so they grab their shovels and they get to work. Ben, well, he's methodical. He marks a spot and he begins digging. After every 10 feet, he pauses, reflects, and sometimes he even struggles. The earth gets harder, the heat more intense, but with every challenge, he dives in deeper, learning and adjusting. Now, Tom, he takes a different approach. He digs 10 feet here, hits a rock, and shifts another 20 feet away, thinking it might be easier. He digs another 15 feet there, then another spot for 12 feet, and so on. Ben perseveres, and after reaching a depth of 100 feet, water gushes out. Tom, on the other hand, sees no success because he keeps jumping from point to point. Even though he put in the same hours as Ben, he didn't yield the same results because he never allowed himself to learn, adapt, and get to the depth required. And sadly, because we don't like to see our own children struggle, we may inadvertently be moving them around from point to point instead of letting them get to that 100-foot depth. And productive struggle, it really paints a scenario where your kids are not just like flying over, skimming over a task. They are tangling with it. They are wrestling it to the ground. They're making attempts and failing and then getting up, dusting themselves off and trying again. This method actually doesn't care about final grades or overall performance. It's really looking at bolstering mental attributes, things like perseverance, critical thinking, and the child taking an active approach to learning new information. It's really very similar to providing your brain with like a very vigorous workout, okay? So your brain is going to become like a gym bro. Obviously, if you just showed up at the gym, it wouldn't be possible for you to bench 100 pounds on your very first day. Well, depending on who you are, right? But you're going to show up, you're going to keep trying, you're going to keep essentially working that muscle and exercising it until you are able to bench that amount. And that's achieved through patience and practice. You cannot just show up and do the thing that's out of your capacity to do. You can't really make it happen any faster. It's one of those things, as I always say, you can't go over, under, around, you have to go through. So when your child is engaging in this kind of productive struggle, they are essentially creating new neural pathways. When your brain starts developing these neural pathways, that's actually what allows it to learn new information and learn new skills easier. And that is referred to as neuroplasticity. And maybe you're thinking, why does this actually matter? Like, why do I need to even be paying attention to this? If my child's doing fine, they're doing fine, right? Let's for a moment picture the inner workings of our brain, shall we? So if we think of our brains like a bustling city, and then it has three kinds of inhabitants. So neurons, synapses, and myelin. And really, you can think of neurons like the communicators of your brain's bustling city. They're like special messengers with branches to catch signals and really a superhighway to dispatch messages. Now, these messengers do not actually touch each other. There's a tiny space in between them, and that's called the synapse. And that space is actually very important because it means that your connections are not permanent. Basically, they're malleable, right? They will link up based on your routines and experiences, creating pathways that inform actions and thoughts. So if we imagine our child's brain as like this vast open space with no trails, as your child is learning new information, they are clearing pathways, rough pathways, through that field to be able to walk on. And so initially the brain signals, they make do with these kind of rough pathways to walk on, right? They kind of stroll along leisurely. But as more and more messages are trying to come through, it becomes pretty clear that we need to make this road more efficient, right? We need to clear this, smooth it, pave it. We need messages to move quicker and more freely through these pathways, right? And that's when the brain is like, we got to do an upgrade. We got to start laying down a smoother path. And that is where the brain's soldiers enter the scene, all right? These are the glial cells and the myelin. Think of the glial cells as like the hard-working crew that sets the stage. And the myelin is like the red carpet that gets rolled out. So the more our brain signals travel down these particular pathways, the more those glial cells start to hustle and produce myelin. The myelin wraps itself around these messenger highways, making those brain signals just zip through like NASCARs. And for a little perspective, okay, a brain signal that is going down a myelinated pathway can go down 100 times faster than one without myelin. So basically you have gone from a rough dirt path in the middle of nowhere to a flippin' bullet train in Beijing, China. So let's bring this back to our kids' brains. So when our kids' brains are first learning and struggling with a new concept, they're really going down a dirt road. As your child continues down that pathway, they start to really pave it. And through practice and persistence, this dirt path will become a bullet train. The key point is that mastering any subject requires struggle. And struggling actually means they're doing it right. Your brain notices the struggle and it is attempting to lay down a path to make this easier in the long run. And obviously this is very helpful for us as mothers when we understand why struggle is important. But what about our kids, right? They don't really care about all this highway, myelin. They don't care, right? Well, that brings me to today's video sponsor, because what I can tell you is children really do learn best when they are active and engaged in what they are doing. There's actually a very fascinating study on this put out by Harvard where despite how people self-reported, despite how students self-reported about how they like to learn, a lot of them were like, we like the lectures. I feel like that's how we learn best. After doing this study, they showed clearly that they actually retained the information and did better when there was an active role in the learning. That's why I love Night Zookeeper, because it's such a fun language arts program for kids from 6 to 12 years old. I'll put the information down in the description box for you, of course, but if you use my link, you're going to get a free 7-day trial and then 50% off your subscription. I've been using it for a couple of years now. It doesn't matter if you already have curriculum that you're using. To me, this is wonderful to add in even to your already existing language arts. And even if you're not homeschooling, language arts, grammar, all of that can be really tough for kids to learn, especially because most of it is done through lecture, basically. So it's a lot harder to retain that. I love that Night Zookeeper is essentially actively involving your child in the learning process through these games, and kids love to learn through games. It really does take the stress out of learning language arts. It makes it genuinely fun, and like I said, it's language arts, but it covers reading, writing, spelling, grammar, and vocabulary. And the levels, of course, can be adjusted to suit the needs of your child, but it really is a chance for your child to feel empowered and to learn independently, which is homeschooling moms we all appreciate. And it's less pressure for you as the parent in teaching language arts. Through using skill games, interactive lessons, and tutor feedback, your child can use Night Zookeeper on their own and make tangible progress, which is obviously what we're here for, right? And even though there's tutor help and all of that, and you can be as involved or not as you want to, there's a parent dashboard where you can keep up with everything that's going on. On all written work, you're going to get personalized tutor feedback. You as the parent don't have to be the bad guy when it comes to grading writing. And again, this really helps you balance the workload across multiple kids. If you have a number of kids that you are homeschooling, this can really help you balance the workload of that. I will put the link down below in the description box for you to check out Night Zookeeper. You can try it free for 7 days, and then you can also get 50% off your subscription. I highly recommend. So one of the first mindset shifts that we really have to have, I feel like people are gonna start throwing tomatoes at me, is that the ultimate goal right now doesn't need to be that your child always gets it right. It just needs to be that they've tried, that they've done it, right or wrong in the end. Effort is what is going to matter in the long run. And if you tie yourself to the outcomes, to the success, to them always getting it right, you're not going to see the value in the productive struggle, and neither will they. So as your child really begins to kind of immerse themselves in a productive struggle, they will start to figure out the questions they need to ask themselves in order to get to the correct answer. You know, really starting to ask the questions of like, well, what is the meaning of this, right? Because when we can tie an actual meaning, an actual real life concept to this thing that we're trying to learn, it makes retention so much easier. And honestly, having your child learn to be that kind of introspective, the sooner the better, because that is invaluable. And this becomes extremely important in subjects like math, right? Where rote memorization can often come at the expense of any like true core understanding of the concepts, which then leads to misunderstandings and a distaste for the subject. How many people do you know do not like math, or will just say like, I'm not good at math, I don't like math? I mean, lots of people don't like math, and I believe it's because the way that many of us were taught was in this memorization without full understanding, because we just needed to get through and keep going, right? That we weren't really allowed to go through the productive struggle phase. So if math didn't come easy, then the understanding of those core principles didn't come either, right? We just memorized what we needed to know to get through the test. It's why people, despite taking algebra in high school, many people cannot do algebra at 30, right? Because we didn't actually retain it. If your children are starting to feel disheartened with the struggle, it's our job as parents to remind them how important this struggling phase actually is. Really encourage them to approach the problem from a new perspective, a fresh approach to problems when they are struggling and can't figure it out. Really encourage them to articulate their thoughts, to like do this wrestling on the ground, right, with the thing, right? We're not just going, I don't know, and walking away. We are going to struggle with it. We're going to wrestle with it. We're going to reason it. We're going to think it out. I think one of the best things we can do for our kids is to help them see how a little bit of discouragement in the process is not uncommon, and it's actually good that you're struggling. We can reframe this for our kids. And while they're doing all this struggling, behind the scenes, the brain is working really hard to smooth this pathway for them, to make the knowledge that they're going to gain very smooth and efficient. So if you go back to our Ben and Tom story, think about how sad it would be if we just kept taking our brain away and moving it to a new spot. Worry about this, think about this, focus on this, instead of letting it do the things it needs to do to get to that depth it needs to get to. And it's like, you're so close, right? Like how many times was Tom so close, but then got overwhelmed and said, nope, I'll just go to a new spot, right? Like it's sad to look at that and think how close he got to the 100-foot depth, but just kept giving up and moving to something else. There's a balance, right? We cannot just leave our children to flounder with no support and no help. That is not at all what I am encouraging. That will obviously lead them to be frustrated and probably resentful. We can't eliminate the problem and the struggle for them, but we can help guide them and support them so that they feel like it's okay for them to make mistakes as they get to the point of understanding. And if we really embrace this concept of productive struggle and we help our kids to embrace it, guess what? what? In the future, as they come upon things that they are struggling with, they are going to have some adaptive skills they've built in dealing with this. They're going to know how to strategize, how to set some goals, some milestones, and hopefully realize that that feeling of like success and kind of triumphing over the struggle actually stems more from confidence than it does from actual academic knowledge. So, how can we start implementing this with our kids? Well, one of the first things that you should know that surprised the heck out of me is that forgetting is actually a part of learning. It's like our brain's quirky little way of making room for the actual important stuff, right? The stuff that we use all the time. The rest of it gets stuffed in the back of a closet somewhere and our brain forgets about it. So one way that we can kind of work on this with our kids is that instead of just opening up the book and revisiting the lesson in the way that we might normally do it, before we even crack open the book, having your child answer some questions and maybe do like some practice tasks or something, depending on the subject, before you actually even open the book to review the lesson, right? We're going to see what's actually still here. And this is where utilizing short answer or fill in the blanks is markedly better for this kind of retention than using like a multiple choice test. We want to see what can our brain pull out of the archives. There's another strategy too, which is like varied practice sessions. So instead of focusing super heavily on one subject when you are practicing something or like just drilling in on one task, we get like kind of deep into one subject and then we put our thing down, flip it and reverse it and ask them questions about something else that we learned a little while ago that's relevant to what we're learning, but not a part of this like deep tunnel of what we're doing right now, right? So by asking them to do that, we are really helping them to work on that retention and that recall to be able to recall information quickly, even if it's somewhere back in the back gathering dust. So if we were like talking about plant reproduction, in the middle of that, put your pollen tube to work. Anybody ever see Grease 2? Okay. In the middle of like plant reproduction, we might just stop and go like, oh, hey, bud, do you remember when we talked about the water cycle a couple weeks ago? How do you think the process of evaporation might relate to how plants release their seeds? It kind of feels like a curveball, but when we're actually intertwining these subjects, when we do it like this, we're challenging their brain, which is actually helping to reinforce both the new and the old information. Plus, it's really essential to learning and fully understanding that learning is not a linear path. So sometimes the zigs, the zags, the circles, the ups, the downs, they actually make the learning more durable and most of the time a little more fun along the way too. By doing this blending of concepts, we're kind of putting the child's brain on notice that like, hey, be alert. Be on the lookout for connections. And this is really going to help with that deeper understanding and retention. While we're zigging and zagging and learning all over the place, the other important concept to remember is pacing the learning, okay? There's only so much you can stuff into the trash can. Your brain's not a trash can, but you know what I mean. There's only so much that you can stuff in there. So more like intense, almost like sprints, right? Like shorter and more intense, challenging, but not like overly drawn out. Those kinds of lessons like sprinkled throughout the week and do a little in the afternoon and a little here and there. It's really helpful again for retention because our brains are like sponges. So they really absorb more when we give them a chance to soak things in a little bit at a time. And of course, don't overlook the importance of sleep and memory in our learning retention process. Going to sleep at night and getting an adequate amount of sleep is necessary for your brain to move things from short-term to long-term, sort of solidify that information in your mind. Sleep is a very important part of that. So make sure your kids are getting adequate sleep so that they can actually retain the information that they've learned. If we can remember that learning is not a race to the finish line, racing other kids to be the best all the time. True deep learning and knowledge is about creating these very like intricate superhighways in our brains of information, knowledge, and of course, that's going to require a certain amount of struggle. And guess what? You struggling, it means you're doing it right.